The first time I saw my husband kill a man, he was still wearing the soil from our garden on his hands. I remember that detail more than anything else from that day. The brown earth under his fingernails, the gentle smell of the Valesi blossoms he had been planting only minutes before, and the way his expression carried absolutely no trace of anger or fear as he moved through the corridor, like something that had been sleeping for years and had finally opened its eyes. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the morning of the day that changed everything, because that morning was still quiet, and the quiet is what makes the rest of it so difficult to explain. My name is Violith Sakhorin. I am the eldest daughter of Emperor Draven, heir to the Koran sovereignty, ruler of 11 star systems, and protector of 400 billion souls. I have been trained in diplomacy, war theory, fleet command, and the delicate art of holding together an empire that has survived for 9,000 years. I am not easily impressed. I am not easily frightened. And until that particular morning, I believed with absolute certainty that I understood exactly who I had married. His name was Declan Voss, and he was human. The marriage had been arranged 2 cycles earlier as part of a minor diplomatic gesture toward the Sol Confederation. Humanity was new to the galactic stage. They were a small species from a single star system, with modest ships, limited colonial reach, and no significant military reputation. My father considered the union beneath our house, barely worth the ceremony it required, but his advisors argued that a symbolic bond with Earth's people would cost us nothing and generate goodwill in the border sectors where human traders were beginning to appear. So I accepted. Not out of love, not out of curiosity. Out of duty, the same way I accepted every other responsibility that came with being heir to an empire. Declan arrived at the palace on Athara with a single travel case, a data tablet loaded with Quran language tutorials, and a nervous smile that showed too many teeth by our standards. He was tall for a human, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way he never seemed to bother fixing, and gray eyes that always appeared to be watching things a little more carefully than the situation required. He spoke softly, almost too softly for a species known for their loud voices. He learned our customs with genuine enthusiasm, stumbling through formal greetings and apologizing when he mispronounced the tonal inflections that gave Quran words their deeper meanings. He cooked meals for the palace servants, which scandalized the kitchen staff, because no royal consort in the history of the sovereignty had ever entered a kitchen voluntarily. He memorized the name of every guard in the palace within his first month. The court found him charming in the way you find a tamed animal charming, endearing and harmless. A curiosity from a primitive world that happened to produce creatures capable of basic conversation. I grew fond of him across those 2 cycles, in the way you grow fond of something warm and uncomplicated, in a life filled with sharp edges and political calculations. He was kind. He was patient. He made me laugh when no one else in the palace could manage it, and he never once attempted to leverage his position as royal consort for political gain. He seemed genuinely uninterested in power, which was so foreign to the Quran court that most people simply assumed he was too simple to recognize the opportunity. I thought I knew him. I thought he was exactly what he appeared to be, and that belief was the most dangerous mistake I have ever made. That morning, I stood on the balcony of our private chambers and watched him in the garden terrace below. He was on his knees in the soil, carefully transplanting a row of Valesi blossoms from their nursery pots into the raised beds he had built by hand over the previous season. The palace gardeners, who maintained 300 acres of formal grounds, had offered repeatedly to do the work for him. He insisted on doing it himself. He hummed while he worked, some melody from his homeworld that I did not recognize, and the sound drifted up to me through the warm morning air, like something from a world far less complicated than mine. He looked up and caught me watching him. He smiled, the same easy, open smile he always wore, and held up a flower in each hand. The blue ones or the white ones for the banquet table tonight? Both, I said. He nodded, as though I had given him a critical military order, and went back to his planting with renewed focus. I shook my head and turned away from the balcony, already running through the preparations for the diplomatic reception that evening, and the 70 dignitaries I would need to charm without offending any of their conflicting political positions. The banquet was routine in every way that mattered. Representatives from 3 allied systems had come to renew trade agreements that had been in place for generations, and the grand hall was filled with the kind of careful laughter and veiled negotiations that I had grown up navigating the way other children learned to walk. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across tables, laden with delicacies from 7 worlds. Musicians played softly from the balcony above, their instruments producing harmonies that were mathematically calibrated to promote relaxation and trust among the gathered dignitaries. Everything was controlled, measured, and designed to produce a specific outcome. Declan stood beside me in formal Quran robes that he wore without complaint, the high collar and layered fabrics adapted by the palace tailors to accommodate his broader human frame. He greeted guests with the warm, disarming openness that had become his signature at these events, the quality that made everyone instinctively like him, and absolutely no one take him seriously as a political figure. He complimented the Solari ambassador's daughter on her linguistic studies, asking specific follow-up questions about her thesis on cross-species phonemic structures. He inquired about the Vorath trade minister's grandchildren by name, remembering details from a conversation they had shared months earlier. He moved through the gathering with a social grace that was both genuine and invisible, the kind that put people at ease without ever drawing attention to itself. The court tolerated him. Some found him endearing. Most considered him irrelevant. A decorative addition to the royal household, like a piece of exotic furniture that happened to be capable of conversation. It was near the end of the 3rd course when Admiral Torvan approached our table. Torvan was old guard military, a decorated veteran of the border campaigns who had spent 40 years commanding fleets and had never approved of my marriage to an alien. He was the kind of officer who believed that the Koran sovereignty's strength was rooted in purity, and the presence of a human consort in the royal household was a stain he could not overlook. He had consumed too much wine that evening, and his voice carried deliberately across the nearby tables when he spoke. "Your Highness," he said, inclining his head to me with minimal respect before letting his gaze slide to Declan with open contempt. "And the pet. Tell me, human, do they let you out of your quarters without a leash, or does the princess carry one in her ceremonial sash?" The tables around us went silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every eye in the vicinity turned toward us, and I felt the familiar heat of protective anger rise in my chest. But before I could speak, Declan answered. His voice was light, casual, perfectly timed. "No leash, Admiral. Though I did ask for one when I first arrived, the palace supply office said they were out of stock. Apparently the last shipment was requisitioned to outfit the senior admiralty." Laughter rippled through the surrounding tables. It was the good kind of laughter, the kind that releases tension and shifts the power in a conversation, and Torvan's face darkened as he realized the joke had landed cleanly enough to make him look foolish if he escalated. He muttered something about human humor being a poor substitute for human accomplishment, and moved away. I turned to compliment Declan on his composure, and that is when I saw it for the first time. His smile was already back in place, warm and genuine, and perfectly fitted to his face. His posture was relaxed, his hand resting easily on the table beside his water glass. Everything about him projected the same gentle harmlessness he always carried, but for a fraction of a second before the mask returned, I had seen something else. His eyes had gone flat when Torvan spoke. Not wounded, not embarrassed, not angry, just empty, like someone had pulled a curtain aside for half a heartbeat and shown me a room with nothing in it. No warmth, no humor, no gentle gardener who hummed while planting flowers. Just a vast, controlled stillness that existed behind those gray eyes, like deep water beneath ice. And then the curtain closed, and Declan was himself again, smiling and reaching for his glass, and the moment passed so quickly that I told myself I had imagined it. I almost convinced myself, almost. I did not sleep well that night. The image of that empty expression kept surfacing in my mind, and I could not reconcile it with the man lying beside me. At some point past the middle watch, I woke and found the bed empty. I rose and walked through our chambers, until I found him standing on the balcony, perfectly still, staring at the stars. His hands were at his sides, not resting on the railing the way a person admiring a view would stand, but hanging loose and ready, the way someone stands when they are waiting for something. His breathing was slow, controlled, and rhythmic, the breathing of a person who had trained their body to remain calm under circumstances that demanded anything but calm. Declan? He did not turn immediately. There was a pause. It lasted no longer than a heartbeat, but it was long enough for me to notice, and long enough for something cold to settle in the base of my stomach. Then he looked over his shoulder and smiled, and the familiar warmth flooded back into his expression, like sunlight returning after a cloud passes. "Could not sleep," he said. "The stars are different here. I keep trying to find Sol, but the angle is wrong from this hemisphere." I accepted the explanation. I went back to bed. He followed a few minutes later and settled beside me, and his breathing evened out, and I lay in the darkness telling myself that everything was fine, that my husband was a kind man who planted flowers and deflected insults with clever humor, and sometimes stood on balconies at night because he missed the star he had been born under. In the morning, the transmission came. I was in my study reviewing the trade documents from the previous night's reception when my chief of staff, Counselor Ilara, entered without knocking. That alone told me something was wrong. Ilara was the most protocol-conscious person on my staff. She had never once entered my study without knocking in the 6 years she had served me. "A vessel has crossed the outer sovereignty boundary," she said, her voice carefully controlled in the way that professionals adopt when the information they are carrying is worse than they want it to be. "It is refusing all communication hails on every standard frequency. It has not responded to automated identity challenges. It is maintaining a direct course for Ithara at a speed that suggests military-grade propulsion. Current trajectory projections indicate arrival in approximately 4 hours." "One vessel?" I asked, setting down my documents. "Send a patrol wing to intercept and redirect." "We have dispatched 2 patrol frigates." The vessel deployed electronic countermeasures that disrupted our targeting arrays at engagement range. The patrol wing has been forced to fall back to a safe distance and is currently shadowing the vessel without the ability to establish weapons lock. I stared at her. Our targeting arrays were military-grade systems, the most advanced in the sovereignty, capable of tracking objects across light seconds of space with pinpoint accuracy. They had been designed to withstand electronic warfare from the most sophisticated species in the known galaxy, tested against every countermeasure in our threat database, and hardened through 9 generations of iterative improvement. A single vessel, regardless of origin, should not have been able to disrupt them. The fact that it had done so suggested technology we had never encountered and never accounted for. "What is the origin signature?" I asked. Ilara hesitated. That was the second thing she had never done before, and the cold feeling from the previous night returned to my stomach with force. "The signature came back as Terran," she said. "Specifically, it is flagged in our database as a black registry vessel, no civilian transponder code, no military identification number. It does not exist in any database the Solo Confederation has shared with us during the diplomatic exchange." I stood and walked to the window of my study, looking down at the garden terrace where Declan had been working that morning. He was still there, kneeling in the soil, his hands buried in the earth around a row of white Velesi blossoms. From this height, he looked small and peaceful, and completely unaware that anything unusual was happening above his head. "Has my husband been informed?" I asked. "No, Highness." "Inform him. Ask him to come to the command center immediately." 15 minutes later, Declan walked into the command center, with garden soil still on his sleeves and a smudge of dirt across his right cheek. He looked around at the tactical displays glowing with trajectory data and the tense faces of my military staff, and I watched his expression with more care than I had ever watched anything in my life. He gave no sign of recognition, no visible reaction to the data on the screens. He simply stood beside me, folded his hands in front of him, and waited with the patient attentiveness of a man who had been invited to observe something outside his area of expertise. "A Terran vessel has entered our sovereign space," I told him. "Black registry, no identification. It is heading directly for this planet, and has already demonstrated the ability to neutralize our patrol frigate's targeting systems." I expected confusion. I expected the wide-eyed concern of a civilian suddenly confronted with a military situation. Instead, Declan looked at the tactical display showing the incoming ship's trajectory and speed profile, and he asked a question that no cultural attaché, no diplomatic spouse, no civilian of any species should have known to ask. What classification is the vessel? The room went quiet. Officers exchanged glances. Admiral Torvan, who had sobered considerably since the previous evening, answered with visible reluctance. Modified corvette class, Terran construction. No registered civilian configuration matches the hull profile. Declan's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, barely visible, a slight flex of the muscle along the edge of his mandible. No one else in the room would have noticed it, but I was watching for exactly that kind of slip, and I caught it, and what it told me turned the cold feeling in my stomach into something much worse. He was not confused by this information. He was not frightened. He was recognizing it. The way you recognize a sound you have heard before, a pattern you have seen before, a threat you have faced before. He turned to me, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and level, and stripped of every trace of the gentle warmth I had grown accustomed to. The man who arranged flowers, and joked with admirals and asked about table decorations was gone, replaced by someone whose voice carried the flat, controlled precision of a person delivering a tactical briefing. Vialith, I need to speak with you privately, right now. We stood in the anteroom off the command center, the door sealed behind us, and the person looking at me wore Declan's face but carried himself like a different human being. His shoulders were set differently. His weight was distributed on his feet in a way that spoke of readiness rather than relaxation. Even his breathing had changed, slower and deeper, drawn from the diaphragm rather than the chest. "The ship is here for me," he said. I almost laughed. The idea was absurd. A Black Registry warship crossing sovereign alien space, defeating our patrol frigate's targeting systems, heading directly for the throne world of an interstellar empire. All for a man who spent his mornings gardening and his evenings asking about dinner arrangements. Declan, that is ridiculous. You are a cultural attaché. Why would anyone send a warship for you? Because I was not always a cultural attaché, Vialith. The words settled into the room like stones dropping into still water. He said them simply, without drama or inflection, but each one carried a weight I had never heard in his voice before. A weight that had been there all along, I realized, hidden beneath the easy smiles and the humble mannerisms and the careful performance of harmlessness. I waited. He continued. Before the Sol Confederation reassigned me to this post, I was something else entirely. The people on that vessel belonged to an organization called the Harrow Syndicate. It is a Terran black operations network that went rogue during the Sol expansion wars. They started as a Confederation intelligence asset and evolved into an independent criminal enterprise with military capabilities. My unit was tasked with dismantling their operations. Over a 3-year period, we destroyed 3 of their primary operational cells. We cost them billions in assets, hundreds of trained operatives, and their entire senior leadership chain. I searched his face for any sign of exaggeration or fabrication. I found none. He was telling the truth with the same matter-of-fact simplicity he used when explaining how to prune a flower stem. They rebuilt, he continued. They always rebuild, and they have been hunting every member of my unit since the day we shut them down. Every person on my team is either dead or relocated under deep cover on the far side of settled space. Deep cover? I repeated slowly. You mean hiding? He met my eyes without flinching, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw something in his expression that looked like an apology. Not for the danger, for the deception. The Confederation did not send me here as a diplomatic gift, Vialith. They sent me here to disappear. Your empire was considered remote enough and militarily powerful enough that the Syndicate would not risk entering your sovereign space to reach me. You were my cover. This marriage, this palace, the gardens, the banquets, all of it was designed to bury me so deep that they would never find me. He paused. It appears they found me anyway. The room felt smaller. The walls felt closer. My husband, the gentle, harmless human I had married, out of diplomatic obligation, and grown fond of out of genuine affection, was telling me he was a fugitive soldier hidden inside my court, like a blade concealed in a bouquet of flowers. Before I could form a response, Ilara's voice crackled through the comm system with controlled urgency. Highness, long-range sensors have detected 4 additional vessels dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the system's edge. Classification: 2 frigates, 1 heavy cruiser, and one light carrier. All vessels are displaying Terran hull configurations. They are converging with the corvette on an intercept course for Ithara. 5 ships. Not a scouting party. Not a probe. An invasion force designed to overwhelm any resistance and extract a single target from the most heavily defended planet in the sovereignty. Declan closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, the last trace of the man I had married was gone, and in his place stood someone whose eyes held the focused stillness of a weapon being loaded. "I need access to the palace armory," he said. I brought him to the armory myself. The guards of the Royal Watch lined the corridor, their ceremonial armor gleaming, their expressions shifting between confusion and unease as they watched Declan walk past them with a stride that carried an authority none of them had ever seen in the gentle foreign husband of their princess. They looked to me for guidance. I nodded. They stepped aside. The armory occupied an entire floor beneath the palace's central keep. Racks of Koran plasma rifles, energy lances, shock batons, and heavy assault cannons filled the cavernous space in neat, gleaming rows. Declan walked past all of them without a single glance, as though the most advanced weapons in the sovereignty were furniture he had no use for. He moved to the far end of the chamber, to a section I barely knew existed, a climate-controlled storage area for confiscated contraband. Items seized from Sol traders and smugglers over the years had been catalogued, shelved, and forgotten. Declan scanned the shelves with an efficiency that told me he had already mapped this room in his memory during some previous visit I had not noticed. He opened a battered metal case and found a human-made sidearm. It was ugly by our standards, a blocky, angular thing with none of the elegant lines of Koran weaponry. Where our weapons looked like art, this looked like a tool designed by people who cared only about function. He picked it up, and his hands transformed. That is the only way I can describe it. The hesitant, careful fingers that handled flower stems and garden soil changed into something mechanical and precise. He disassembled the weapon in 3 seconds, inspected each component, reassembled it, tested the slide mechanism, examined the barrel's interior, and loaded a magazine of Terran ammunition that he found in an adjacent case. Every movement was fluid, practiced, and impossibly fast. He had not touched a weapon in 2 years. His muscles remembered anyway. He found a second sidearm and repeated the process with identical speed. Then a compact knife with a blackened blade that he secured against his inner forearm, beneath his sleeve, using a strip of cloth he tore from a storage cover, without hesitation. Then 3 small devices I did not recognize, cylindrical objects no larger than my thumb, which he distributed into specific pockets of his clothing, with the practiced efficiency of a man following a routine he had performed thousands of times. He knew exactly where each item belonged on his body, which pocket, which angle, which hand, would reach for which device. It was muscle memory so deeply embedded that 2 years of gardening and cooking had not erased a single step. I watched his face throughout the process and saw no excitement, no dread, no reluctance. His expression was neutral, in a way that went beyond calm. It was the face of someone performing a task as natural to them as breathing, as automatic as the beating of their own heart. The transformation was not dramatic. There was no moment where he straightened his spine and declared himself ready. It was gradual and total, like watching water freeze. One moment he was the man I knew. The next, without any single identifiable change, he was someone else entirely. He turned to me, and I saw it fully for the first time. Not the glimpse from the banquet, not the shadow from the balcony. The complete picture. The flatness in his eyes was not emptiness. It was capacity. It was the look of a man who contained something vast and dangerous, and who had spent 2 years keeping it locked behind a door that was now swinging open. "The Syndicate will send ground teams," he said, his voice carrying the clipped cadence of someone delivering a combat briefing. "Their ships carry enough operatives to bypass your orbital defenses using Terran stealth insertion technology that your sensor grid was never designed to detect. They will be inside the palace perimeter within the hour. Your Royal Guard are brave and disciplined, but they have never fought humans in combat, not humans like these." "What should I expect?" I asked. He paused, and for a single moment, something softer moved behind the mask. Regret, or grief, for the version of himself that was already fading like morning fog. Expect them to be faster than anything your people have ever fought. Expect them to be creative and aggressive in ways your tactical doctrine does not account for. Expect them to use technology your forces have no countermeasure for. And Violethith. He hesitated. Expect me to become someone you will not recognize, someone I have spent 2 years trying to stop being. An alert shrieked through the armory speakers. The Syndicate fleet had deployed drop pods, 30 of them, streaking through the upper atmosphere on a direct trajectory to the palace complex. Declan checked his weapons one final time, settled his breathing with a long exhale that seemed to push away the last remnants of the man I knew, and moved toward the door with a stride that belonged to someone else entirely. I followed him. Because whatever he was about to become, I needed to see it with my own eyes. The drop pods struck the palace grounds like a steel rain. Each one punched through the atmospheric defense shields that should have intercepted them, and the shields died in cascading failures, as electronic warfare pulses, I had never encountered, scrambled every targeting system we possessed. 30 pods. 30 Syndicate operatives in Terran exoframe armor. They deployed across the palace perimeter in a pattern that covered every entrance, every access point, every vulnerability in our defense grid, as though someone had given them a blueprint of the entire complex. The first engagement happened in the eastern wing. I monitored it from the command center through the tactical display, while Declan stood beside me, watching the data streams with an intensity that made the officers around him shift uncomfortably. The Koran Royal Guard, warriors who had trained for 30 years in the most demanding combat academies in the sovereignty, met the Syndicate operatives in the eastern corridors and were pushed back in under 2 minutes. I watched it happen on the display, blue dots retreating, red dots advancing. My soldiers were not losing because they lacked courage or skill. They were losing because every assumption their training was built upon was wrong. They expected enemies who moved at biological speed. The exoframes amplified human reflexes to levels that turned our combat models into fiction. They expected enemies who fought in predictable patterns, based on the tactical doctrines of known species. The Syndicate operatives fought like water flowing through cracks, finding every gap, exploiting every blind spot, adapting to every defensive measure in real time. "They are too fast," Admiral Torvon said, and for the first time since I had known him, his voice held genuine fear. The human soldiers are wearing mechanical augmentation frames that amplify their speed and strength beyond anything in our combat databases. Our guards cannot acquire targets quickly enough to engage effectively. Declan spoke without looking away from the tactical display. They will reach the central wing in 12 minutes at this rate of advance. Our models project 14 minutes, one of my tactical officers said. Your models are wrong. They are running a standard 3-prong clearance pattern. The eastern push is a feint designed to draw your reserves forward. The real assault corridor is through the service tunnels beneath the north wing and through the rooftop maintenance access above the throne hall. They want to pin your forces between 3 converging fronts and collapse the defensive perimeter inward. You have approximately 8 minutes before the north tunnel team reaches the central junction. The room went completely still. Every officer stared at him. Even Torvon was silent. "How do you know that?" the Admiral finally asked, the words dragged from him by necessity, rather than willingness. Declan turned from the display and looked directly at the Admiral with an expression that contained no warmth, no humor, and no trace of the man who had made jokes at a banquet table the night before. "Because it is the same clearance pattern I designed for the Sol Confederation Marine Corps 6 years ago. The Syndicate stole it from our operational archives. They are using my own playbook against me. Silence. The kind that swallows everything, the kind that reshapes your understanding of the person standing in front of you and the ground you thought was solid beneath your feet. I need 5 of your best remaining guards," Declan said. "Position them under my direct command. Pull every other unit back to the throne room and seal the blast doors. Do not engage the Syndicate in the corridors. You will lose every exchange. Consolidate your defense in a single fortified position and give me freedom of movement in the approach corridors." Torvon's face flushed dark purple. "I will not take tactical orders from a human who arranges table flowers." "Then in 8 minutes, the Syndicate will breach this room and kill or capture everyone in it," Declan said. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "And they will do it using tactics that I invented. wearing technology that I helped develop, following protocols that I wrote. The gardener is the only person on this planet who knows how to counter all of it. Your pride or your people, Admiral. Choose now. I stepped forward before Torvald could respond. Do as he says, immediately. The Admiral looked at me, then at Declan. The internal struggle played across his face, like weather across a sky. Pride warring with survival, prejudice battling evidence. Survival won. He issued the orders with a voice that cost him something to use. Declan took the 5 guards I assigned to him, 3 veterans of the border campaigns, and 2 close protection specialists from my personal detail, and moved into the corridors of the North Wing with a speed and purposefulness that transformed the air around him. He did not walk the way my guards walked, with the measured discipline of trained soldiers following established protocol. He moved the way predators move, low and fluid, and aware of everything, each step placed with an economy of motion that wasted nothing. I was supposed to remain in the command center. I did not. I followed him into the corridor, because the man walking away from me was a stranger, wearing my husband's face, and I needed to understand who he truly was before this day was over. He knew I was behind him. He did not stop or turn around. He simply said, over his shoulder, in a voice stripped of everything except the information I needed to survive, stay behind me at all times. Do not step past my shoulder line. Do not touch anyone I put on the ground, even if they appear unconscious. Some of them will be faking, and they will still be armed. The syndicate operatives came through the service tunnel access point exactly where Declan had predicted, exactly when he had predicted. 4 of them, moving in tight combat formation, their exoframes whirring softly as servos amplified every muscle movement. They were fast, terrifyingly fast. They cleared the tunnel junction in seconds and began advancing toward the central wing in a leapfrog pattern that covered every angle of approach. Declan was waiting for them behind a structural column, 20 meters from the junction, positioned in a shadow that the tunnel's emergency lighting did not reach. He had placed the 5 guards at intervals along the corridor behind us, creating a layered fallback. But as it turned out, the guards were unnecessary. What happened next destroyed every belief I had ever held about humans. He engaged the first operative at close range, stepping from the shadow with a lateral movement so precise it looked choreographed. The operative had been scanning the corridor with a weapon-mounted sensor system. Declan moved under the sweep of the sensor arc, inside the operative's guard, and stripped the combat rifle from the man's hands, using a twisting motion that leveraged the exoframe's own joint structure against its wearer. I heard the snap of the operative's wrist breaking inside the armored gauntlet. Declan drove the stock of the captured rifle into the gap between the operative's helmet and neck guard with a force that dropped the soldier like a severed string. He was already moving before the body hit the floor. The second and third operatives opened fire. The corridor lit up with the blue-white flash of Terran weapons discharge. Declan used the fallen soldier as momentary cover, rolled behind a support column, and fired his sidearm twice. Both shots found their targets, the narrow seams at the inner elbow of the exoframe armor, where the plating thinned to allow the joint full range of motion. The gap was barely 2 centimeters wide. He hit both of them while moving, from a distance of 15 meters, in the time it took me to draw a single breath. Both operatives staggered as their arm servos lost power. Declan closed the distance before they could switch to their secondary weapons and put them down with strikes that targeted the remaining gaps in their armor with anatomical precision. The fourth operative charged him, probably reasoning that momentum and mass would overcome a single unarmored human at close range. Declan sidestepped the charge, caught the operative's extended arm, and used the forward momentum of 200 kilograms of armored soldier to redirect the man headfirst into the corridor wall. The impact cracked the wall's structural plating. The operative crumpled and did not rise. 4 soldiers, trained, armored, augmented by mechanical frames that had overwhelmed my elite royal guard. Declan put all 4 of them on the ground in less than 10 seconds. He did not shout. He did not curse. He did not roar with battle fury, the way Quran warriors did. His breathing remained steady throughout. His movements were systematic, efficient, and devoid of any emotion I could identify. He checked each corner of the corridor the same way you read text on a screen. Left to right, top to bottom, systematic, thorough, patient. This was not fighting. Not in any sense my people understood the word. Quran combat was athletic, dramatic, built on centuries of refined martial tradition that prized form as much as function. What Declan did had no form. It had no drama. It was ugly and close and brutal and efficient, and it worked with a terrifying perfection that made my blood run cold. The 5 guards behind us had not fired a single round. There had been no time. Declan had moved through the syndicate operatives faster than trained soldiers could acquire targets. During a brief lull, as Declan ejected his magazine, checked the remaining rounds, and reloaded with a motion so practiced it looked involuntary, I stepped beside him. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Tell me everything now." He did not look at me immediately. He was scanning the corridor ahead, reading the geometry of the next intersection, calculating angles and distances and probabilities that I could not see, but he apparently processed as naturally as breathing. When he finally turned, his eyes held something complex. Not guilt, not pride, not the clinical detachment I had seen during the fight. Something in between. Something that existed in the space between what he had been and what he had tried to become. My operational name was Commander Declan Voss. I was the field leader of Unit Obsidian, a 4-person Terran kill team attached to the Sol Confederation's Special Activities Division. Over a 3-year deployment, my unit carried out 17 deep cover operations targeting the Harrow Syndicate's leadership infrastructure. We identified their command nodes, infiltrated their communication networks, and dismantled their organizational chain from the inside. We destroyed everything they built. He paused. His eyes moved back to the corridor, checking. When the operation concluded, the Confederation decided I was a liability, not because I had failed, because I had succeeded too completely. The skills I used to dismantle the Syndicate could be turned against any organization, including the Confederation itself. So they erased my service record. They created a new identity for me, cultural attaché, diplomatic consort, and they placed me in the most harmless, most unreachable assignment they could find. He looked at me. "You." The Syndicate adapted its approach within minutes, which Declan had told me they would. Adaptability, he said, was the most dangerous trait the Syndicate operatives possessed. They learned from failure faster than any conventional military force he had ever encountered, and they shared information across their tactical network in real time. Every tactic that had failed was cataloged and countered within seconds. The team that came through the rooftop access points had already adjusted their formation to account for close-range engagement, spreading wider, maintaining greater distance between operators, denying Declan the clustered targets he had exploited in the tunnel junction. 8 operatives rappelled into the throne hall from above, while the remaining Syndicate forces redoubled their push through the eastern corridors to stretch our defenses across multiple fronts simultaneously. Declan repositioned the guards at the throne room's secondary entrances, with specific instructions for each pair, telling them exactly what range to maintain, which angles to cover, and which weapons to use based on the corridor geometry at each position. He spoke to them in the clipped, precise cadence of a commander who had briefed hundreds of soldiers, and my Quran guards, who had never taken orders from a human before, responded to his authority as though it had always been there. Then he took the primary approach corridor himself, moving through the palace with a familiarity that confirmed my growing suspicion. He had mapped every corridor, every service conduit, every structural weakness during his 2 years of pretending to be harmless. The gardening and the cooking and the charming conversations had been genuine, but he had also been building a tactical map of the entire palace inside his mind, preparing for a day he hoped would never arrive. Each engagement was different. He never repeated a tactic. Against a lone operative in the west corridor, he closed distance and neutralized the threat at arm's length, using the enemy's armored bulk against him. Against a pair that flanked him near the council chambers, he created an angle that forced them to choose between engaging him and hitting each other, then dropped both in the half-second of hesitation that choice created. Against the 3-person team that breached the South Passage, he triggered the palace fire suppression system to flood the corridor with chemical vapor, then moved through the cloud, using sound and spatial memory to locate each target while their sensors struggled with the interference. He knew what their technology could do and what it could not do, because he had trained with the same equipment. He understood their tactical instincts, their communication rhythms, their decision-making patterns under stress. He was fighting a mirror of himself, and the mirror could not keep up, because the original was always one step ahead of the reflection. But there were too many of them. The palace was too large, the entry points too numerous, and my guards were losing ground despite their courage and determination. The syndicate was herding us inward toward the throne room, and even Declan could not be in every corridor at once. The syndicate's leader arrived with the final wave. Her name was Marin Gall, and she walked through the damaged corridors of my palace with the casual authority of someone who had already claimed ownership. She was human, tall and lean, with short silver hair and eyes that reminded me of Declan's. They shared that same flat, watchful quality, the look of someone who processed the world as a series of threats and opportunities, rather than experiences to be lived. She wore a command-grade exoframe, sleeker and more advanced than anything her soldiers carried, and she moved flanked by 6 personal guards in a close protection formation that spoke of absolute discipline and rehearsed precision. She broadcast on an open frequency as she approached. Her voice was smooth and controlled and carried a confidence that bordered on amusement. "Pale Horse, I know you are in there. I watched your work on the way in. 14 of my operatives down in less than 20 minutes. You have not lost a step." Declan stood at the center of the throne room. I stood behind him, flanked by my remaining guards, and the palace staff who had taken shelter when the fighting began. The blast doors were sealed, but the cutting marks from syndicate breaching tools were already visible on the inner surface. "She was my handler," Declan said quietly. His words meant only for me. "During the infiltration phase of the syndicate operation, I spent 14 months embedded inside their organization, passing intelligence back to the Confederation. Marin was my contact on the inside. She was supposed to be a double agent working for our side. Instead, she turned. She took the syndicate's remaining assets and intelligence archives and used them to rebuild the entire network with herself as its head." "You trusted her," I said. "She was the best operative I had ever worked with. Brilliant, disciplined, impossible to read. I trusted her completely. She used that trust to disappear with enough classified intelligence to reconstruct everything we destroyed and make it stronger." The blast doors shuddered under a focused cutting beam. White-hot sparks cascaded across the floor in arcing trails. The guards raised their weapons and braced. Marin's voice came through the comm again. "I did not come here to fight you, Declan. I came to make you an offer. The Syndicate has a new operation, larger than anything we have ever attempted, and I need someone who thinks the way you think. Someone who sees the patterns before they form. Come out, take your place beside me again, and the princess and her people walk away unharmed." "And if I refuse," Declan said into the open channel, "then I will reduce this palace to melted glass and sift through the rubble until I find what is left of you. And I will begin with the princess, so you understand precisely what your refusal costs." Declan looked at me. Both versions of him were visible in that look, layered on top of each other, like 2 images printed on the same page, the gardener and the weapon, the husband and the soldier. Both of them were looking at me with the same expression, and I realized with a sudden clarity that the expression was not conflict. It was resolution. He had already decided. "Stay behind the throne," he said. Then he turned to face the buckling doors, and his breathing settled into that slow, metronomic rhythm I had heard in the dark corridors. And his hands stopped moving, and he became the thing that the Harrow Syndicate had spent years and ships and soldiers trying to find. The doors fell inward with a grinding shriek of torn metal. Smoke poured through the gap, thick and acrid. Through the haze, Marin walked into the throne room of the Koran sovereignty, with her 6 guards fanning out around her in a formation that covered every angle of fire. She stopped 10 meters from Declan and studied him with an expression of calm satisfaction. No armor, no exoframe, garden soil still under his fingernails, from the morning's planting. "You brought 6, he said. "That is flattering, but you should have brought more." Marin's smile tightened at the edges. Not with fear, with recognition. She knew exactly what he was capable of. and the fact that he was standing there, unarmed and calm, was the most dangerous thing she had ever seen. "Lights," Declan said. The word meant nothing to anyone in the room except him. But somewhere in the palace's electrical infrastructure, a command he had planted during the fighting, a simple override code entered into the maintenance console while we had passed through the north wing, activated. Every light source in the throne room died simultaneously. The darkness was absolute. The Quran throne room was a fortress chamber buried in the heart of the palace, windowless and sealed. Its illumination was entirely artificial, and in the space of a single heartbeat, every source went black. The guard's exoframe sensors switched automatically to thermal and low-light imaging, but Declan had triggered the fire suppression system at the same instant, flooding the upper reaches of the room with a burst of cold vapor that scrambled thermal signatures into meaningless noise. In the darkness, I heard him move, not his footsteps, his breathing, that steady, controlled rhythm. 1, 2, 3. Then the sounds of impact began. A joint forced past its structural limit, a body hitting stone, the sharp metallic snap of an exoframe servo being destroyed from within, a choked gasp cut short, another impact, another fall, each sound precise, measured, and final. When the emergency lighting activated 30 seconds later, casting the room in pale amber, 5 of Marin's 6 guards were on the floor. The 6th was on his knees, with Declan's arm locked around his throat, using the operative's own exoframe collar as a fulcrum. The man's face was dark. His armored hands clawed uselessly at Declan's bare forearm. Marin had not moved from her position. She stood exactly where she had been when the lights went out, and she was watching Declan with an expression that sat somewhere between professional admiration and something darker. Hunger. The hunger of someone who has spent years searching for a lost weapon and has finally located it. "Let him go," she said. "He is just a soldier." Declan released the hold. The operative collapsed to the stone floor, gasping and clutching his throat. Declan stepped over the fallen man and faced Marin across 3 meters of open space. Neither of them moved toward a weapon. "You always were the best," Marin said, "even when you were pretending to be someone's tame pet." "I was never pretending, Marin. I was trying to become someone different. You would not understand the distinction." She tilted her head, studying him the way a craftsman studies their finest work. "The Confederation abandoned you, Declan. They erased your records. They wiped your identity. They shipped you to the far edge of mapped space because you frightened them, not because you failed at your mission, because you succeeded too well. You proved that a single human operative, properly trained and properly motivated, could dismantle an entire organization from the inside. That kind of capability is not an asset, it is a threat." Declan did not deny it. "I accepted being erased. I accepted the assignment. I accepted all of it, because the alternative was becoming exactly what you became." "And what did I become?" "Exactly what they trained us to be. No restraint, no boundaries, no part of yourself held back from the work. The only difference between us is that I stopped, Marin. I chose to stop, you chose to keep going." Marin laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound. "And yet here you are, doing exactly what you were built to do. Standing in a dark room over unconscious bodies. The flowers and the cooking and the charming little domesticated act. That was never you. This is you. This has always been you." I stepped forward from behind the throne. I do not know where the courage came from. Perhaps it was not courage at all, but something closer to fury. The kind that builds slowly and quietly when someone walks into your home, threatens your people, breaks your walls, and then presumes to define the character of a man who chose your world over theirs. "You are wrong," I said. Marin turned to me. Her eyes were sharp and assessing. "The princess speaks. I was wondering when the royal audience would begin." "You are standing in the throne room of the Quran sovereignty," I said, and my voice carried the full weight of 9,000 years of unbroken imperial authority. "This palace, this planet, this system, these stars belong to my people. And the man you are trying to reclaim chose to stand in front of me, not beside you. He chose to protect people he was under no obligation to protect. He chose to plant flowers in soil that is not his own, on a world that is not his home, among a species that treated him as a curiosity rather than an equal. Those choices are not a disguise. They are who he is, and you do not get to tell me otherwise. Marin stared at me for a long, measuring moment. Then she looked at Declan. Is she always this dramatic? She is the heir to an empire that has survived longer than your species has had written language, Declan said. She has earned the right. The brief flicker of amusement in Marin's expression died. Her face hardened into the mask of an operative who had run out of patience and theatrical conversation. Enough. She touched a control interface on her wrist guard. All units, commence orbital bombardment of the Palace complex. Authorization Gal 7. My blood went cold. I looked at Declan, expecting desperation, expecting a last-second scramble for some impossible solution. Instead, he looked almost relieved, as though she had done exactly what he needed her to do. I was hoping you would give that order, he said. Marin paused. Her finger hovered over the wrist control. What? When you activated the orbital bombardment protocol, your cruiser's primary communication array opened a two-way tactical channel with the surface. That channel is now carrying a secondary signal on a sub-band frequency that your shipboard electronic warfare suite does not monitor. A signal I triggered 40 minutes ago, using a piece of confiscated Terran communications equipment I found in the Palace Armory. What signal? A coded burst on a Sol Confederation black channel, a frequency I was never supposed to know still existed. It was decommissioned from the official registry 3 years ago, but the Confederation never actually shuts down a black channel. They just stop admitting it exists. I sent the burst and gambled that someone on the other end was still listening. The throne room shook. Not from orbital bombardment. From something happening in the space above our world. Something violent enough to transmit through planetary crust and palace foundations. Every tactical display in the room flickered to life as the sensor grid rebooted from its electronic warfare suppression, and what the screens showed stopped every Koran officer in the chamber mid-breath. 3 vessels had materialized in orbit. Sol Confederation stealth destroyers. They were angular and predatory, their hull profiles unlike any Terran vessel in any database the Sovereignty possessed. They had been there the entire time, hidden in the electromagnetic interference zones of Ithara's magnetic poles, maintaining silent running, watching, waiting for exactly this moment. And now they were engaging the Syndicate fleet with a speed and violence that turned the orbital tactical display into a cascade of red emergency indicators. The Syndicate cruiser was crippled in the first exchange. 2 Confederation destroyers bracketed it from opposing vectors and stripped its weapons arrays with surgical precision strikes that disabled offensive capability without destroying the ship. The 2 frigates attempted to break for open space. The 3rd destroyer cut off their escape trajectory and herded them back toward the engagement zone, with the casual efficiency of a shepherd managing wayward animals. Terran military technology against Terran criminal technology. The military version was a generation ahead, and the difference showed in every exchange. The Syndicate ships fought back with desperate aggression, but their weapons scored no effective hits on the Confederation vessels, which moved with an agility that our own fleet commanders later described as impossible for ships of that tonnage. Marin watched the orbital display. Her face did not crumble. She was too disciplined, too controlled for visible collapse. But something behind her eyes dimmed, the way a light dims when someone slowly turns down the power supply. They were watching you, she said. They were always watching me, Declan replied. The Confederation did not abandon me, Marin. They relocated me. There is a difference, and you missed it because you assumed they thought the way you think. You believed they erased me because I was too dangerous to keep. The truth is the opposite. They kept me because I was too valuable to lose. They put me here, in a place where I would be comfortable and visible, and they waited, because they knew that sooner or later, you would come looking. You could not help yourself. I was the one target you could never leave alone. You were bait, Marin said. I was an anchor. You came to me. You brought your fleet. You showed the Confederation the full scale of what you rebuilt. 5 ships, a carrier, hundreds of operatives, enough military hardware to threaten sovereign alien space. 1 corvette, they might have monitored. This fleet is enough to authorize a full military sweep of every Syndicate cell in known space. You did not walk into a trap, Marin. You built the justification for your own destruction and delivered it personally. Marin's hand drifted toward a small device clipped to her belt. It was a subtle movement, almost unconscious, the kind of gesture made by someone reaching for their last contingency. Declan shook his head slowly. The dead man trigger linked to the Palace fusion core, he said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who has already resolved every variable in the equation. The one your advanced team planted during the initial breach, behind the tertiary coolant manifold on sublevel 4. It was a clever placement. Shielded from standard scans by the reactor's own magnetic field, your demolition specialist knew what he was doing. Marin's hand froze in mid-motion. I found it, and disarmed it 90 minutes ago. The specialist is unconscious in a maintenance closet on sublevel 3. He will have a headache when he wakes up, but nothing permanent. I found it while you believed I was pinned down in the North Wing corridors. I was never pinned down. I was moving through the palace, on a specific route that allowed me to sweep your team's insertion points for secondary devices, while simultaneously herding your forces toward the throne room. Every engagement in the corridors served two purposes: eliminating operatives and pushing survivors toward a single location, this room, where they would be contained when the Confederation fleet arrived. The realization crossed Marin's face like a shadow. She had played every card, committed every resource, and the man she had come to recruit had been manipulating her entire operation from the moment she entered the system. You could have ended this faster, she said quietly. You could have triggered the Confederation signal immediately and had me arrested in the first 5 minutes. I needed the Confederation to see your fleet fully deployed. I needed them to record the scale of your operation inside sovereign alien space. A single corvette is a nuisance. 5 warships violating the territorial boundary of an allied empire is an act of war. That distinction matters in the Confederation Council chambers, where authorization for full military action requires evidence of proportional threat. Marin closed her eyes. When she opened them, the fight was gone from her expression. What remained was something I did not expect: respect. Tired, bitter, genuine respect. You used me, she said. I learned from the best. The blast doors opened one final time, and this time, the figures who came through were not Syndicate soldiers. Confederation Marines in matte black tactical armor entered the throne room in a precise diamond formation, their weapons covering every hostile contact in the room with practiced efficiency. They moved with the same terrifying competence I had witnessed in Declan, and I understood then that this capability was not unique to him. This was what humans were beneath the surface. All of them. Behind the smiles and the diplomacy and the flower arrangements, every human carried this capacity for controlled, deliberate, overwhelming force. The lead Marine, a stocky man with a scarred jaw and calm, experienced eyes, approached Declan and snapped to attention with a salute that held genuine reverence. Commander Voss, Lieutenant Harlan Price, Seoul Confederation Special Activities Division, 3rd Fleet. We have secured orbital superiority and are processing Syndicate prisoners. That name does not exist anymore, Lieutenant, Declan said. Price smiled. It was the smile of a soldier delivering a message he had waited a long time to deliver. It does on our books, sir. It always did. Marin was taken into custody without resistance. She walked between 2 Marines with her chin raised and her eyes forward, and as she passed Declan, she spoke a single word. Gardens. He did not respond. He watched her go, and then he stood in the center of the ruined throne room, surrounded by unconscious operatives and shell-shocked Koran guards, and the settling dust of a battle that had reshaped my understanding of everything I thought I knew about the man I married. He turned to me. The operational mask was fading. Beneath it, I saw exhaustion and honesty, and something fragile and afraid. Not afraid of the Syndicate, or the Marines, or the political consequences. Afraid of me, of what I now knew, of what I might decide. We need to talk, I said. I know, he said. The diplomatic fallout consumed the following weeks. My father was furious in a way I had rarely seen across my entire lifetime of watching him govern. The Emperor of the Quran sovereignty had unknowingly hosted a Sol Confederation Black Operations agent in his own court. married to his own daughter, sleeping in the royal household for 2 full cycles. The magnitude of the deception shook the foundations of every diplomatic assumption we had built regarding the human species. The Seoul Confederation sent a formal delegation led by Ambassador Catherine Lowe, a composed woman with silver-streaked hair, and the measured patience of someone who had spent her entire career explaining human actions to angry aliens. She stood before my father's council with a calm that bordered on surgical, and delivered explanations that satisfied no one. Commander Voss was placed in the Koran court under a dual-purpose arrangement, Lowe said, choosing each word with visible care. The marriage was genuine in its diplomatic intent. We valued the relationship with the sovereignty, and the union represented a sincere gesture of goodwill. The secondary purpose was protective custody. The Confederation needed Commander Voss hidden in a location the Harrow Syndicate could not easily reach, and we needed a capable operative positioned in sovereign alien space who could respond to Terran origin threats if they materialized beyond our borders. You placed a trained killer in my daughter's household and called it diplomacy, my father said. His voice could have frozen reactor coolant. We placed a protector beside your daughter, Emperor. The distinction is meaningful. Commander Voss specifically requested a non-combat assignment after the completion of Operation Obsidian. He wanted to stop. He was psychologically evaluated, cleared, and given the choice between deep cover at several available locations. He chose the Koran assignment because he read the cultural briefing and decided it was a place where he could build something rather than destroy something. He chose it, I repeated from my seat beside the throne. He was not assigned. Lowe turned to me and nodded. He reviewed 7 possible cover locations and selected the Koran sovereignty. When asked why, he said the culture valued patience and structure and beauty, and those were things he wanted to learn. My father dismissed the delegation without resolution. That evening, in the privacy of his study, surrounded by walls that had witnessed 40 years of imperial decisions, he told me he wanted Declan removed from the court, the marriage dissolved, and the human returned to soul space immediately. I refused. He is dangerous, Violeth, my father said. He is a soldier who chose to stop being a soldier. There is a difference. He deceived you. He deceived all of us. He was ordered to, by his government. And when the moment came to choose between following those orders and protecting this court, he chose us. He could have surrendered himself to the syndicate and ended the crisis without a single shot. He fought for people he was under no obligation to fight for. He fought because that is what weapons do when you point them at a target. Weapons do not plant Velacy blossoms, Father. Weapons do not memorize the names of palace guards. Weapons do not cook for servants, or ask their wife which color flowers to put on a banquet table. He chose those things. Every single day for 2 years, he chose to be gentle, when being dangerous would have been easier. My father studied me with the calculating gaze of a man who had held an empire together for 4 decades. He understood power in all its expressions, and I could see him processing a calculation he did not want to make, that the man I had married possessed every skill required to seize influence in the Koran court, and had chosen instead to kneel in the dirt and grow flowers. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want my husband to stay, and I want you to see him clearly." That night, I found Declan in our chambers. He was standing by the window that overlooked the garden terrace, his hands resting on the sill, his eyes tracking the damage below. The syndicate drop pods had cratered the grounds, churning the soil and shattering the raised planter beds he had spent months building by hand. The Velacy blossoms were crushed, their blue and white petals scattered across broken earth like fragments of something beautiful that had been carelessly destroyed. He did not turn when I entered. He knew my footsteps the way he knew everything, completely, precisely, and without visible effort. "What was real?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, repair crews moved across the palace grounds with lights and tools, but inside our chambers the silence held. "I need you to understand something," he said finally. "The cover identity the Confederation designed for me was constructed to be as different from my operational profile as possible. Gentle, open, domestic. Interested in gardening and cooking and social engagement. None of those traits were supposed to be genuine. They were camouflage. A costume designed to make me invisible. That is not what I asked. He turned to face me. His eyes were stripped bare, every mask removed, every layer peeled away, and what I saw beneath all of it was a man standing at the intersection of two versions of himself, unable to fully release either one. Somewhere in the first cycle of our marriage, I stopped performing, he said. The flowers became real. I planted them because I wanted to watch something grow that I had not destroyed. The cooking became real. I cooked because feeding people felt like the opposite of everything I had done before. Remembering the guards' names was real. I learned them because I wanted to be part of a community that was not built on classified briefings and operational security. He paused. I asked you about the flower colors because I wanted your opinion, not because the mission called for it, because your opinion mattered to me. I was trained to become anyone, Violith, to adopt any personality, any set of mannerisms, any identity. The problem is, I became someone who wanted to stay, and I do not know how to undo that. I crossed the room and stood directly in front of him. He was taller than me by a significant margin, this death-world human with his heavy bones and dense muscles, and yet he looked at me as though I was the dangerous one, as though my next words held the power to do something to him that no syndicate operative could ever match. Then stay, I said. The following day, I visited the medical wing to see Captain Kale, my personal guard commander. He had taken a plasma burn across his left shoulder and a fractured leg during the syndicate assault, but his mind remained as sharp and observational as ever. Your husband saved 2 of my guards during the fighting, Kale said, adjusting his position on the medical platform with a soldier's impatience for injury. In the North Wing corridor, about 6 minutes into the engagement, 2 of my best were down with injuries. Exposed positions, no cover, directly in the line of fire. Commander Voss broke from his own engagement, crossed 4 meters of open corridor under active fire, and pulled both of them behind a structural column. He was fighting at the time, I said. He was actively engaged with 2 syndicate operatives who were advancing on his position. He neutralized one, created a brief window by forcing the second into cover with suppressive fire, and used that window to reach my guards. He applied a field medical technique I have never seen before, something involving pressure and chemical activation that stopped the bleeding in both wounds within seconds. He did this while maintaining visual contact on the corridor and calling adjustments to the guards behind him. Kale met my eyes with the straightforward honesty of a career soldier. A pure weapon would have stepped over my guards. They had no strategic value to his mission. Saving them cost time and exposed him to additional risk. A pure killer, operating on nothing but tactical logic, would have left them and continued to the objective. He chose to stop. He chose to kneel in the middle of a firefight on a palace floor that was not his own and save 2 Quran lives that meant nothing to his operation. He held my gaze. He fights like a demon and heals like a saint. I do not understand your husband, Highness, but I trust him with my life, and I trust him with yours. Those words stayed with me through the weeks of council sessions and diplomatic arguments and furious debates about human treachery and alien infiltration. They stayed with me when I walked into open court 3 days later and did something no Quran heir had done in recorded history. I addressed the full assembly. My father sat on the throne above me, his expression carefully neutral. The council members, military leadership, and diplomatic corps filled the great hall in ordered ranks. Declan stood at the very back of the chamber, near the main doors, positioned as though he was prepared to leave if the decision went against him. The council has recommended the removal of my consort, Declan Voss, on the grounds that his presence constitutes an unacceptable security risk to the sovereignty, I said, projecting my voice to fill every corner of the hall. I am here to formally reject that recommendation. The murmurs began immediately. I raised my hand and continued. Declan Voss is my consort by law and by choice. He has lived among us for 2 cycles. He has respected our customs, contributed to our household, and invested himself in our community with a sincerity that many born into this court have never matched. When enemies came to our gates, armed with weapons our defense forces could not counter, employing tactics our military had no training against, he placed himself between those enemies and our people without hesitation. He asked no permission. He negotiated no terms. He saw a threat to the people he had chosen to live among, and he acted. I paused, and let the silence build until it had weight. If the sovereignty wishes to remove him, you will first need to remove me. The heir to the Quran throne does not abandon the people who bleed for her. The court erupted. Voices cascaded over each other, some angry, some cautiously supportive, most caught between tradition and the undeniable evidence of what had happened within these walls. Old guard officers like Torvan argued that the deception alone was grounds for expulsion, regardless of the outcome. Younger diplomats countered that the outcome was precisely the point, that a man who fights for a nation not his own has proven his allegiance more thoroughly than any oath. The legal scholars debated precedent and jurisdiction. The military strategists debated threat assessment. Everyone had an opinion, and every opinion was loud. I stood at the center of the storm and held my ground. I had prepared for this moment the way I prepared for every political battle, with research, with arguments, with the understanding that conviction without composure is just noise. But underneath the preparation, underneath the diplomatic training, and the imperial posture, there was something simpler driving me. I had watched my husband choose, over and over and over, to be kind when he could have been dangerous, and I was not going to let anyone punish him for that choice. Emperor Draven was not watching me. He was watching Declan, and Declan was standing at the back of the hall, behind me, not beside me. He had the training and the capability to command any room he entered. He could manipulate. He could intimidate. He could, if he chose, project the kind of authority that would silence the court through sheer force of presence. Instead, he stood quietly at the rear of the chamber, with his hands folded in front of him, waiting for a princess to decide his fate. He was letting me lead. My father saw it. I know he did, because his expression shifted in the way that only a daughter who had studied that face for a lifetime would recognize. He looked at Declan and understood something that the rest of the court was still struggling to process. He saw a man who could take the throne by force and was choosing not to, who could seize control and was choosing to stand one step behind his wife. That kind of restraint, exercised by someone with that kind of capability, was the most powerful statement any being had ever made in my father's throne room. The Emperor did not order Declan's removal. 1 week later, a new position was created within the sovereignty's diplomatic and military structure. Terran Military Liaison to the Quran Court. The title had no precedent and no formal job description. It was, in essence, a quiet admission that the Quran sovereignty had miscategorized an entire species. Not just Declan Voss, all of humanity. The position was offered to Declan. He accepted it with the same grace he accepted everything else. A nod, a quiet word of gratitude, and no visible pride or triumph. He did not celebrate. He did not make speeches. He simply nodded, as though being formally recognized by an alien empire after 2 years of pretending to be invisible was just another item on a long list of things he would handle with quiet competence and move on from without fanfare. On the evening after the appointment was formalized, I found him on the garden terrace. The sun was setting over Ithara's western ridge, painting the sky in deep amber and soft violet. The air was warm and carried the scent of soil and new growth. Declan was on his knees in the dirt, replanting Velesi blossoms. He had sourced fresh seedlings from the palace botanical wing, and he was setting each one into the carefully turned earth with the same precise, gentle movements he had used to disassemble armed soldiers 3 weeks earlier. I stood beside him and watched his hands work through the soil, packing it around each stem, adjusting the angle of each leaf to catch the fading light. There was earth under his fingernails again. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and I could see the last fading bruise on his forearm from the fighting, a yellowed shadow on skin that had dealt and absorbed violence I still had not fully processed. "You are replanting," I said. "They were almost ready to bloom," he replied without looking up. "Another few weeks and this entire terrace would have been covered in white and blue. It did not feel right to leave the beds empty." I knelt beside him. The soil was warm from the day's sun, soft and rich between my fingers. I picked up a seedling and held it uncertainly, and he reached over without looking and adjusted my grip, repositioning my fingers so the root ball would settle naturally when I placed it in the ground. We planted together in silence for a while. The palace hummed with activity around us, repair crews and security patrols and the distant murmur of diplomatic communications. But on the terrace, the only sounds were the shift of soil, the soft click of a gardening tool, and the occasional evening bird, calling from the ornamental trees at the terrace's edge. "I am not afraid of you," I said. He did not look up. His hands continued their careful work in the soil. "You should be. I am not afraid of the pale horse, Declan. I married the man who chose to plant flowers instead of riding." He stopped. His hands rested in the earth, still and steady, and he looked at me with an expression that held nothing back. No operational mask, no careful performance, no camouflage. What I saw was a man who had been given every reason to become something terrible, who carried inside him a capacity for violence that would terrify the most hardened warriors in my empire, and who chose, every single day, to kneel in the dirt and coax life from the soil instead of taking it from the living. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For letting me stay." I did not answer with words. I picked up another seedling and placed it in the soil beside his, pressing the earth gently around its base the way he had shown me, and we worked together as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars appeared above us. The evening air cooled around us, carrying the scent of turned soil and growing things, and the distant hum of a palace putting itself back together. We moved down the row, side by side, filling each empty space with a new plant, patting the earth into place, adjusting stems, clearing debris from the damaged beds. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. The work itself was the conversation. Two people choosing to build something in a place where something had been destroyed, and that choice said everything that needed saying. By the time the last seedling was in the ground, the terrace looked like something that could bloom again. Not yet. Not tomorrow, but soon. The rows were straight, and the soil was fresh, and the small green stems stood upright in the evening air, reaching for a sun that had already set but would return in the morning. Declan brushed the dirt from his hands and stood, and I stood beside him, and together we looked at what we had planted. I used to think my human husband was harmless. I used to watch him tend to flowers and cook for servants, and stand politely while admirals insulted him, and I believed I understood exactly what he was. A gentleman from a minor species, placed in my life as a diplomatic gesture and nothing more. I was wrong. I was profoundly, completely, dangerously wrong. He is the most dangerous being I have ever known. He carries inside him a capacity for controlled destruction that would make the most seasoned warriors of my empire retreat in fear. He sees threats before they materialize, and solutions before others have identified the problem. He can dismantle a room full of armored soldiers with nothing but his hands and his training, and walk out the other side without raising his pulse. And every morning, he kneels in the garden and plants flowers. Every evening, he asks what I would like for dinner. Every night, he stands on the balcony and looks at the stars, and I know now that he is not searching for his home star. He is standing guard. He is watching the dark for the things that might come out of it, so that the people he chose can sleep without knowing what keeps them safe. That is not harmlessness. That is strength I do not have a word for in any language I have ever spoken, and I am grateful, every single day, that this extraordinary, terrifying, gentle man looked at all the darkness he had lived through and chose to walk toward the light, chose this world, chose these people, chose me, and chose to stay.